Hi, in this film I'm going to talk about Joseph Butler, the Anglican clergyman, who in his 15 sermons explained a particular theory of conscience. And at the beginning, let's be clear that this is different from Newman's. Students often lump them together. But Butler's view really comes out of the natural law tradition and is very close to that of Thomas Aquinas. And remember that Aquinas had two words for conscience. One was synderesis, which means a God-given innate disposition, a bit like an instinct to orientate ourselves towards the good. And the second is conscientia, which is the Latin word for conscience, which to Aquinas is reason making right decisions. So it involves a reflective process. And we find that dual emphasis in Butler as well. And what we have with Butler is actually quite a subtle theory of how conscience operates. He takes as his starting point in his second sermon, Romans chapter 2, where Paul gives us two meanings of nature and natural. Paul says that the Gentiles, that is, non-believers, or in today's terms, atheists, are a law unto themselves. That means they pursue their own self-interest and desire. But he also talks about, St. Paul talks about a deeper law that is in operation within the minds of the Gentiles, the non-Christians, which is the law of conscience, which Paul says either accuses or excuses them on the day of judgment. And so Paul argues for an innate sense of right and wrong, a little bit like synderesis in Aquinas' theory. Butler says that conscience is a faculty that all of us share. It's designed into us by God, and it produces in us a principle of reflection, or a way of reflecting on our own actions, and also feelings of guilt and shame. So it's a faculty a bit like our eyes. It allows us to perceive, to see what makes an action right and what makes an action wrong. He calls it a superior principle of reflection. And Butler argues for a hierarchy of influences which control our behaviour. And none of these is particularly necessarily immoral. The first is passions, feelings, desires that we all share, appetites, if you like. The second is self-love, or the desire that we all have to pursue our own self-interest. And Butler says this is entirely reasonable and has no particular moral worth, right or wrong. And thirdly, there is benevolence, which is the capacity to consider the interests of others. And as I mentioned, these are really morally neutral to Butler. And let me just illustrate how they might work. If we are hungry, we are experiencing the appetite or the passion, in Butler's terminology, of hunger. And this leads us towards McDonald's burger bar. And when we're there, we pursue our self-love. We go up to the counter and we order a very large Big Mac and fries and a Coca-Cola. And nothing wrong with that. That is pursuing my own self-interest, my own self-love. But then my friend walks in and says, I haven't got any money. And so we decide, out of an act of benevolence, to share our Big Mac and fries with our friend. And that shows how you can have these three possibilities: purely acting on appetite, experiencing appetite, acting on it out of self-love, and thirdly, overruling it in a sense, or acting out of our own judgment to be benevolent to a stranger, or in this case a friend. What does it depend on? Two things. It depends first of all on the circumstances. So conscience acts in circumstances to prompt us towards moral behaviour. And secondly, it relies upon our judgment, so that judgment making right decisions that Aquinas talks about, reason making right decisions. Notice that conscience can be a number of things at the same time. It can be an instinct, it can be a judgment at the same time. So the two things can come together. And Butler's point is this: self-interest and passion can, in our human experience, overrule benevolence. And if they do that in circumstances where most people would agree, because we all share a common nature, that an action that results from this is wrong, then we are not allowing our conscience or our judgment to have proper control as the supreme authority over our behaviour. Remember, it's designed into us by God. All of us share this capacity for kindness and compassion. We have the capacity to modify, or in some circumstances overrule, self-love with benevolence, with acting in the interests of others in sometimes a very sacrificial way. And so, to conclude, Butler gives us a hierarchy of, in a sense, motivations that control human behaviour. And at the top of them, the one that defines moral behaviour is determined by conscience, a principle of reflection or a faculty that all of us share.